The bullet missed her by 4 inches. She knew because she measured it afterward, the way she measured everything, methodically, without emotion, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. 4 inches. The crease in the mud where the round had landed was still wet when she pressed 2 fingers into it. She looked at her fingers. Then she picked up her rifle and kept moving. That was Staff Sergeant Pryor's first week in the Army. The second week was harder. She had grown up in Macon, Georgia, the youngest of 4 children and the only one who could shoot. Her father, a man named Pryor, who worked sheet metal and came home smelling of metal shavings and engine grease, had taken her to the range when she was 9 years old. Not because she'd asked, because all 3 of her brothers had gone before her, and none of them had taken to it, and Elias Pryor was not the kind of man who wasted a Saturday morning drive without something to show for it. She hit the paper target 7 times out of 10 on her first attempt. Her father looked at the target for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at her. Then he bought her a Sprite from the vending machine by the door and drove home without saying much of anything. She was back the next Saturday and the one after that. By the time she was 14, the range officer, a retired master sergeant named Odell, who chewed tobacco and argued with himself under his breath, had stopped giving her instructions. He just handed her the ammunition. "You don't need me," he said once. "You just need to keep showing up." She showed up. She kept showing up for the next 20 years. The Army wasn't what Pryor had imagined when she enlisted at 22, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had imagined. Something cleaner, maybe? Something more straightforward. She was good at a specific thing. She knew she was good at it, and she had assumed that being good at a specific thing would carry weight. It carried some. Not as much as she expected. Her first assignment was to the 75th Ranger Regiment, a posting that raised eyebrows she learned to ignore. She was not the first woman assigned there. She was, however, one of the few who had scored in the 98th percentile on the marksmanship assessment and then stood at the range in the rain while every other candidate went inside and fired another 200 rounds just to make sure the score was real. The evaluator on duty that day had been a captain named Birch, and he had written something in his notebook while she was firing, but had not shown it to her. She found out later, through the small circulating gossip of shared barracks, that he had written, "Doesn't stop." She considered that a reasonable summary. The team she was assigned to had a name for what they thought she was. It wasn't a kind name. They didn't say it to her face. They weren't entirely without discipline. But she heard it in the pauses between sentences, in the slight adjustment of posture when she walked into a room, in the way the briefings would occasionally stall for half a beat while someone recalibrated what they were going to say. Now that she was standing there, Sergeant First Class Hagen was the clearest about it. He was a broad-shouldered man from somewhere in Minnesota who had 12 years of service and a jaw that looked like it had been poured from concrete and left to set in bad weather. He had served 3 deployments and had exactly 0 interest in any arrangement that hadn't proven itself to him personally. "I'm not saying anything," Hagen told the team, the first day she stood in the briefing room with them. He was technically not looking at her when he said it. "I'm just saying we've built something here. We know how we work. Introducing variables is a liability." There was a pause. "She's not a variable," said Corporal Santee, the youngest member of the team, who had been in the Army for 3 years and still operated with the particular guilelessness of someone who had not yet learned when to stay quiet. Hagen looked at Santee for a long moment. Then he looked at his coffee. "I'm not saying anything," he said again. Pryor stood in the doorway with her gear and her silence and let the moment pass. She had learned not to argue the first week. The first week was never the argument. The first week was the setup for every argument that would come later. She walked to an open seat at the table and sat down. The first month was administrative. Training rotations, evaluations, the particular tedium of institutional bureaucracy that no amount of action movie mythology had ever adequately prepared anyone for. She cleaned equipment, cross-referenced maps, participated in drills that tested reflexes she had already sharpened to a degree that consistently confused the evaluators running the timer. She had long since learned that making a point of performance was its own liability. The numbers would be in the records. The records would speak when the time came. In the meantime, she did her work, ate her meals, and in the evening sat with her back against the wall of her quarters and read whatever she could find, which was mostly whatever the previous occupant had left behind. A worn thriller, a manual on engine repair that turned out to be surprisingly interesting. 2.5 issues of a magazine she didn't know still existed. Santi knocked on her door once, midway through the second week, to ask if she wanted to come to the rec room. She thought about it. Maybe next time, she said. He nodded like that made sense. Then he looked at the engine repair manual in her hand. Is that good? Surprisingly, she said. He left. She went back to reading. The deployment came in early autumn, which meant the desert was hot in the day and cold at night, and the light at dusk turned everything a color that had no real name in English. She had been in theater before, but this particular corridor of countryside was new to her. A series of villages strung along a river valley that military cartographers had labeled in ways that bore little relationship to what locals actually called them. The objective was specific. A high-value target who had been operating in the valley for the better part of a year, coordinating logistics for a network the intelligence community had been trying to dismantle for longer than some of the team's junior members had been in the Army. The target moved frequently. He did not stay anywhere more than 2 nights. He had survived 4 previous interdiction attempts and had, in the process, developed what their intelligence officer described as a working understanding of American operational patterns, which was another way of saying he knew how they thought. The plan was to make him think wrong. Pryor was assigned to overwatch. This was not a concession. It was the correct tactical decision, the kind that didn't require argument because the math was self-evident. She could hold a position, maintain awareness across a wide field of engagement, and make the kind of adjustments at distance that required not just marksmanship but patience, which was its own distinct skill and harder to teach than most people assumed. Hagen didn't say anything when the assignment was read out. He looked at his notebook. She had noticed over the past weeks that when Hagen was recalibrating something internally, he looked at his notebook. She didn't know what was in it. She suspected, based on the angle he held it, that it was mostly blank. They moved out before dawn, which meant moving in the particular darkness of places with no light pollution, where the stars were thick enough to seem structural. She had done this before, but she never quite got over the quality of that darkness, the way it made the ground feel unreliable, even when it wasn't. The route to the overwatch position was 3 kilometers of broken terrain, which her legs handled automatically while her mind ran through the variables. Elevation changes, wind patterns from the briefing, distance to primary, secondary, and tertiary angles of engagement. The weight of the rifle across her back, which she knew to the ounce, and which after enough years had stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like a fact about her body. Santi was on her left as they moved, close enough that she could hear his breathing. He was good in the field, better than people gave him credit for, because he was young and slight, and had a face that made him look younger than he was. She had watched him run a navigation problem 3 weeks earlier that had given 2 more senior operators genuine difficulty, and he'd done it with the quiet concentration of someone who was just trying to get the thing done. Good terrain, he murmured, mostly to himself. Broken, she said. Good broken. A pause. Less predictable. She considered that true. The overwatch position was a ridgeline above the northern edge of the target village, with a natural stone formation that provided cover and a sight line that covered the 3 most probable egress routes. She had identified it on the satellite imagery 2 days earlier and had argued, quietly, that it was the correct position. The team's intelligence officer had agreed. Hagen had looked at his notebook. She was in position by 0400, which gave her 2 hours before first light. She used the time to be still. This was, she had come to believe, the part of the job that was hardest to explain to people who had not done it. The stillness before an operation was not emptiness. It was a specific kind of fullness. All the thinking already completed, all the contingencies already mapped. The mind no longer calculating and therefore free to simply be present in the body, in the air, in the particular quiet of a place that didn't know it was about to matter. She watched the village below come slowly out of the darkness as the sky shifted. Lights in 2 windows, a dog moving between buildings, smoke from a chimney that meant someone was awake and had been awake for a while. She noted all of it without tension. She had learned not to bring tension into the position. Tension was noise, and noise in the body translated eventually into performance degradation, which she could not afford. Instead, she breathed evenly and watched, and let the information accumulate without forcing it into a shape. The radio in her earpiece was quiet. That meant the team on the ground was moving correctly. She waited. It went wrong at 0623, which was 12 minutes earlier than anyone had anticipated. The target didn't use the routes they had predicted. He came out of a building on the eastern side of the village that their intelligence had marked as a grain storage structure and had apparently been wrong about. He had 2 men with him instead of the expected 4. He was moving fast, not running, but the particular rapid walk of someone who had been awake all night and was operating on instinct rather than plan. He was heading for a vehicle. In her earpiece, she heard the team leader, Lieutenant Colonel Vane, say, with the specific flatness of someone managing something unexpected, "Overwatch, we have a change." "I see it," she said. "Options?" She had already calculated. The angle was possible. The distance was within her range by a margin she trusted. There was a wind shift she would need to account for. A slight leftward drift that had appeared in the last 20 minutes as the morning air started moving down the ridgeline. She adjusted fractionally. The man was still moving. 12 seconds, she said. "Give me confirmation." A pause. Then Vane's voice. "Steady, you're green." The vehicle was 60 meters from the target. He was moving at a pace that would put him there in about 9 seconds, which was 3 seconds inside her window. She breathed once. She made the adjustment. She fired. The next 4 minutes were the kind that telescoped time in both directions. Each second, both too long and too short. The body running on something that wasn't quite thought and wasn't quite instinct, but some operational hybrid of the two that she could never adequately describe afterward. The target's 2 escorts reacted. They were professionals. She could tell that immediately from the way they moved, the way they used the vehicle for cover rather than running, the way one of them had a radio up before he'd finished his first step. That meant there were more. That meant the window the team had been working inside was now closed. Vane's voice in her ear. "We have secondary contact, northwest corner, count unknown." "I see the northwest corner," she said. "I count 6. "A beat. You're sure?" "6, she said again. On the ground, the team was in a building they hadn't planned to be in, which was simultaneously better and worse than the alternative. Better, because they had cover. Worse, because cover is only useful for as long as it holds. And 6 additional armed men with local knowledge and a specific motivation to make the team stop breathing was not a situation that improved with time. Hagen's voice came through next, controlled, but with a texture she hadn't heard from him before. "We're going to need a way out." She was already thinking about the way out. The eastern road was not viable. She could see from her position that it was already being approached from the far end, which meant someone had called ahead, which meant the secondary force had not been a spontaneous response. They had been positioned. The intelligence they'd been working from had a gap in it the size of a truck, and that particular realization would matter later, would be the subject of extensive and probably heated debriefing. But right now, it mattered only insofar as it changed the map of what was possible. The northern route, which ran behind a series of low stone walls before opening into a dry riverbed that eventually curved west, was still clear. She tracked it with her scope. It would remain clear for approximately 7 minutes, based on the movement she was observing. "Vane," she said. "Northern route, stone walls to the riverbed. You have a window? How long? 7 minutes? Maybe 6 now? Can you hold the intersection?" She looked at the intersection. 2 angles of approach, manageable if she was precise and did not miss, and she did not plan to miss. "Yes," she said. She held the intersection for 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Afterward, Santee would describe what he had seen from his position during those 5 minutes in a way that she found slightly embarrassing and mostly accurate. He was not a man who exaggerated under pressure. She had noted this early, and it made his account credible, even when the credibility made her uncomfortable. "She didn't move," he said later, to someone who wasn't her. "I mean, she made shots, multiple shots, and between them she was completely still. Like the shots were something separate from her, and she was just there in the position doing math. She was, in fact, doing math. That was not an unfair characterization." The team came out of the northern route at 0651, moving in the deliberate, rapid fashion of people who are holding their composure through an act of collective will. Hagen was at the rear, which she registered without comment. He was covering their exit, which was the correct position for the most experienced operator, which was what he was. Whatever his opinions were, his instincts were sound. When they reached the vehicle and she came down from the ridge to join them, it was Vane who spoke first. He was a lean man with gray at his temples and the particular economy of movement of someone who had long since stopped doing anything for show. "Good work," he said. That was all. She nodded. Then Hagen from the rear of the vehicle said, "The intersection." She looked at him. "That was about as clean as I've seen that done," he said. His voice had the texture of someone producing a sentence that had required some internal work to arrive at. She looked at him for a moment. There was, she noticed, no qualifier at the end of the sentence. He hadn't said for someone who hasn't been in theater long or for someone in your position or any of the framing she had spent a year and a half absorbing. He had said, "As clean as I've seen that done." "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. He nodded and looked out the window. They were back at the forward operating base by 0830. The debrief was long and thorough, and the part about the intelligence gap was exactly as heated as she had anticipated. She sat in her chair and provided accurate information and did not editorialize, which was the correct approach in a debrief, and also the approach least likely to cause the specific kind of friction that would follow her out the door. Lieutenant Colonel Vane ran the debrief with the methodical precision of someone who needed to understand exactly what had happened before he could begin thinking about what came next. He stopped on the overwatch segment twice, asked her to walk through the decision calculus. She did. At one point, Captain Birch, the same Captain Birch who had written "Doesn't Stop" in his notebook 2 years earlier, and who was now part of the command element, leaned forward and said, "When you said 6, you were giving us a number that contradicted the intelligence package. What made you confident?" She thought about how to answer that. "I could see them," she said. A pause around the table. "Yes," said Vane, as if this were a complete answer, because it was. 2 days after the debrief, she was in the equipment bay, doing what she did in most available hours, which was maintaining things that other people maintained less carefully. Her rifle was already clean. She was cleaning it again. The bay was quiet in the mid-afternoon heat, the kind of quiet that accumulated in occupied spaces when everyone capable of making noise had found somewhere else to be. Hagen came in. He didn't announce himself. He wasn't that kind of man. He picked up a piece of gear that needed attention and started working on it, and they were both in the bay, working separately, for approximately 3 minutes before he said anything. "You grew up shooting." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Shows." A pause, the sound of metal on metal. "My father tried to teach me when I was young. I was terrible at it." A short exhale through the nose. "He was very patient about it. I always thought that was more impressive than being good at it." She considered this. It was an unusual thing for Hagen to have said. She wasn't certain whether it was an apology or just a statement, and she decided it didn't particularly matter. "My father didn't say much," she said. "He just kept taking me back." Hagen nodded slowly. They worked in silence for a while. "The intersection," he said eventually. She waited. "The team's been talking about it." He didn't look up from what he was doing. "Not the way you're maybe thinking, the other way." She let that sit. "Santi thinks you're some kind of..." He stopped, reconsidered. "He thinks very highly of your skills." "I know," she said. She had, in fact, heard some of what Santi had been saying, which had required managing her expression on more than one occasion. A longer silence. The heat outside was pressing on the walls of the bay. "When I said variable," Hagen began. "You were right that it's a risk," she said. "Any new addition is a risk." He looked at her then for the first time since he'd come in. "I was talking about something different, and you know it," he said. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze. He had the look of a man assembling something that was taking longer to assemble than he had planned. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words, no embellishment, no condition. The same kind of directness she had always respected, even when it was directed at her for the wrong reasons. "Okay," she said. He went back to the gear in his hands. She went back to the rifle. A week later, command requested her presence at a review session that she had not been informed was specifically about her until she was already in the room. Vane was there. Birch was there. A colonel named Westfield, who oversaw the broader mission set in the theater, was there and had a particular stillness that told her, before anyone said anything, that this was not a routine administrative meeting. Westfield looked at her for a moment, then at the file in front of him, then at her again. "The operation last week," he said. "Yes, sir. The intersection engagement is being reviewed for a commendation." He said it without particular inflection, the way people in his position said things that carried weight without requiring additional ceremony. She said nothing. "Vane tells me," Westfield continued, "that without the overwatch you provided, specifically the 6 count and the subsequent hold, We're looking at an outcome that most likely involves casualties. A pause. Multiple. She nodded once. He also tells me, Westfield said, and there was now something different in his delivery, something that had moved from administrative to personal, that there was skepticism about your placement on this team. The room was very quiet. There's no skepticism now, Westfield said. He said it the way a man says something he has thought about carefully and decided deserves to be said clearly. Not as a performance, not for the room, as a fact being stated to the person it was most specifically about. She sat with that for a moment. Thank you, sir, she said. Her voice was level. It had taken work to make it level, and she thought that was probably fine, that some work was appropriate in a moment like this. She called her father that evening. He picked up on the second ring the way he always did, as if he had been expecting it, which he probably had been because he was that kind of man. How is it, he said. Not a question, just an opening. Good, she said. It's good. A pause. She could hear the TV in the background, the particular low murmur of evening news. They taking care of you out there? She thought about the debrief room. About Hagen in the equipment bay saying I was wrong with no condition attached. About Vane's voice on the radio, steady in the moment when steadiness was the only useful thing. Yeah, she said. They are. Another pause. The TV murmur. You eating? She almost laughed. Yes, Dad. I'm eating. Good, he said. That's important. They talked for a while longer, not about anything significant. The way people who are significant to each other often don't need to be talking about anything specific to be saying what needs to be said. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, in the particular quiet of the FOB at night, which was a different quiet from the quiet before an operation, less loaded, more provisional, the silence of a place that was resting rather than waiting. Outside, someone was laughing. Somewhere across the compound, a generator cycled through a gear change. The stars in this part of the world were the same kind she remembered from Macon, extravagant, indifferent, permanent. She had measured the bullet crease once with 2 fingers and kept moving. She had kept moving every day since. She thought she could keep moving for a long time yet.